Hey guys, Argent here with a reactionary review of All Quiet on the Western Front. The book, of course, not the movie. I just used the movie poster because I kind of liked it. Now, for those of you who don't know, I work a job that's quite a ways away from where I live, so I have about 3 hours of commute time every day. And I listen to audiobooks on my phone, so that's kind of why I do so many book reviews. Just because when I get through a book and I kind of have something to say about it, I figure why not do a review of it? Because kind of the point of reaction reviews is they're not supposed to be time sensitive. I guess some of the new movie ones are, but generally speaking, I'm trying to build a library. So if people have a particular work they want to look up, they can just go through the playlist and go, oh, Argent did a review on this. Let's see what that has to say. So All Quiet on the Western Front, for those of you who haven't read it, is a classic book written in the 1920s, Germany, written by Erich Maria Remarque, and I probably butchered that. But it is part historical fiction, part, I guess, kind of memoir of Eric's, I'll just call him Eric because I can't do Erich very well, of Eric's experiences in World War One. He fought as a soldier in World War One. He was wounded numerous times, and after a couple years of fighting, he spent the rest of the war in a field hospital. Now, I think it's important to note that he begins the book by saying this book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure. For death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped its shells, were destroyed by the war. And I think that sets a very good tone for the book. The book is not supposed to be political. It's very similar to the Kubrick movie Paths of Glory, which I should do a review on at some point. Paths of Glory is neither really a pro-war or an anti-war movie. It's more about demonstrating, I guess, kind of the hardship and the challenges that the average soldier has to go through, and kind of the arbitrary and often absurd nature of war. It's not really, and this book is not exactly commentary on the war itself, nor is it really advancing a political position, although it kind of gets to that by the end, but we'll talk about that in a minute. It's noticeable that a lot of people in Germany, particularly among the far right, really despised this book when it came out. They called Eric a pacifist, a traitor, a Marxist, etc., etc. From what little I've been able to find out, it didn't seem like any of that's true. A lot of people said he was overly critical and overly cruel about the treatment by officers and particularly by doctors. Once again, though, experience may vary, particularly as most of this book takes place during 1918. I would imagine resources were stretched very thin at that point, and the remaining doctors and nurses were driven to exhaustion and, in many cases, insanity. The Nazis banned the book and burned it, and Eric was forced to flee and go into exile. So, what's interesting, though, is there was never any accusation that he was not German or that he was Jewish. I believe he was a Bavarian Catholic. Yes, how much he actually practiced his faith. He had a fairly strict Catholic upbringing. How much it stayed with him for the rest of his life, I'm not sure. So what can be said about All Quiet on the Western Front? It's kind of hard to go into the plot because the plot is not exactly told like most stories. I would call this the book that Slaughterhouse-Five was trying to be. I've tried to read Slaughterhouse-Five numerous times, and I regard it as one of the worst pieces of trash I've ever tried to read. I normally get about 4 or 5 chapters in, and just so much random just nonsense happens, and just disgusting stuff with no purpose. I just can't read it. I find it completely just horrific. I know my friend Abstract made it to the last chapter, and he couldn't bring himself to finish the book. And I think Slaughterhouse-Five was trying to demonstrate kind of the often absurd and arbitrary nature of life, and particularly of war. And that gave birth to kind of the infamous expression, "so it goes," in reference to nothing can be done, that's just the way fate spins. And I think this book does a much better job of it. I think, based on just all the historical reading I've done, this probably is one of the most accurate portrayals of what life is like for a soldier, particularly during World War One. And I'd say World War One is probably one of the worst wars of all time, even worse than World War Two in a lot of cases. Well, I guess there's at least one war that's had a higher body count, and there's certainly been wars that have had a lot more mass atrocities, like the conquest of the Mongols. I find it really hard to think of a war in which the living conditions for the soldiers were worse. Because, I mean, and this book really puts it across. So everyone had to live in trenches. The trenches were dug into the earth. When it rained, the trenches would fill up with water. If you were lucky, they'd put boards down so you could walk across those. But your feet were almost constantly wet. Your lower body was almost constantly wet. You were always crouched in the dirt and mud. You were always dirty. There was really no way to bathe. You were covered in lice. And you just had to sit there. You couldn't really walk around. You couldn't really go take a breath of fresh air or whatever. I mean, at least in like World War II, the troops got to move around a bit. You got to march. And I know people don't like marching, but it's better than sitting in a hole all day, and people were shitting and pissing in the hole, and in the holes, and it was absolutely horrific. And all day, every day, you're getting hit by artillery. You don't know where the artillery is going to land. You don't know if it's going to kill you. It makes sleeping impossible. It's also really boring, because about 90% of the time you're just sitting around waiting for them to attack you, or for an officer to tell you to attack. You don't really have a picture of the bigger war, and that's something kind of this book does very well. It avoids almost all mention of strategy. There's no mention of strategy. There's no real mention of what the offensives are called, what part of the line they're on. They don't really talk about that much, because it's just supposed to be the experience of one soldier. They really have no idea how the war is going. They just are kind of in this traumatized limbo. It almost kind of feels like some depictions of the afterlife, where they just, or are just, I don't know, something like Sixth Sense, where they don't realize that they're dead already. And they just basically wait. They play cards sometimes. They kill rats and roast them and try to eat them. Whenever birds land, they shoot them and try to eat those. By this point in the war, the blockade that Britain's imposed on Germany means what food they have left is turnip bread, or bread with so much sawdust in it it's almost inedible. They're so desperate for food, they often go on trench raids, which, if you don't know what a trench raid is, it's often during the middle of the night. You run across no man's land into the other people's trench. You try to find some supplies. You grab the supplies and run back. So they're so desperate for food because high command won't give them, doesn't have any resources left. They will go across the battlefield because the British soldiers get large meat rations. They get a lot of bully beef, which is basically corned beef. They get bread, they get beer, cognac, a lot of chocolate. So they'll run across and do that. And every time they do that, they'll lose like 20% of their guys. But they're so hungry and so bored, they don't really have anything else to do. And they just keep shooting people. They just keep fighting. Sometimes the lines move 20 feet in one direction. Sometimes the lines move 20 feet in the other direction. It doesn't really matter. And I think it's just something people don't really realize about the soldiers is most of the time, battles don't always last very long. The overwhelming majority of the time is you hiding in a foxhole waiting for something to happen, keeping your head down to avoid machine gun fire, etc. And I think this book really does a good job of showing that. I think the book also does a very good job of showing what severe stress and kind of depression can do to people. It's probably the best portrayal of post-traumatic stress disorder I've ever seen. And I know before people say, well, Argent, you've never been in a situation like that. Well, I haven't, but I have gone through like severe periods of suicidal ideation and like nervous breakdowns. And I can kind of really, I feel like the way just how they describe how detached they are just their inability to really think about anything in the future. I find that is a core feature of severe depression. Is it really lowers how far you can see into the future, which is probably part of the reason where suicidality comes from. Because you're not able to even think, oh, tomorrow might be better, because your time horizon has shrunk from years to minutes or hours. And that's kind of what it's like in this. And there's really no sign that there's going to be an end at any point in the future. So they're just kind of stuck there. And about the only thing that they have left to hold on to is the camaraderie, the friendship between the band of brothers. And one by one they get killed. Many of them just get little wounds, but they become infected and they die. The main character, Paul, is given 21 days leave, so he goes back to his home village. And when he goes there, he just feels completely alienated. People talk about how Germany's about to win the war. They talk about strategy. They make fun of him and dismiss him when he talks about how horrible the conditions are at the front. And it's just, he can't relate to his father anymore. His father just asks him about things, but he's just in such a different mental state. He can't relate to other people anymore. And I know how that feels. When I'm in a severe depressive state, or a mixed state where I'm manic and depressed, I feel like burning the world, or just basically throwing myself in front of a train. And just the mental perspective is so different, and your range of emotions and the dysregulation of them is so different. You lose the ability to really kind of empathize and interact with people. And kind of as the book goes on, and particularly after he goes there, Paul doesn't know what he's going to do after the war ends. When he goes home, he just kind of wants to go back to the front line so he can be with his friends, because he doesn't see value in anything other than his friendship anymore. And as the war goes on, more and more of his friends die, and he becomes more and more despondent, to the point where he bribes, when he gets wounded, he bribes a series of officers so that he can go with his best friend to a field hospital. However, it doesn't work out. I think his friend dies. So many of his friends die, it's confusing. But he winds up getting patched up and sent back to the front. And ultimately he dies in October of 1918. Literally like 3 weeks before the war ends. And that was just kind of another theme of it. During World War I, Germany lost its last chance at victory when the spring offensive failed. Basically, they had beaten Russia, and they had about 100 divisions or so who came from Russia, and it temporarily gave them a large manpower advantage over the Western Allies. So they figured they had to end the war before America arrived. So they used all the remaining reserves and launched a full-scale assault. After it ended, the Allies brought all their troops over and began the 100-day offensive. But basically the war was over at this point. Germany just continued to fight on for basically no reason. And Paul just died for basically so that the German government could save face. And if there's anything kind of political about this, it's the kind of the perspective that soldiers are just tools for whoever's in power. It's interesting that because Paul and his friends specifically signed up for the war, they weren't conscripts. They signed up for the war to be because they wanted to serve their country. They wanted to make Germany great. But ultimately, the country they gave everything for wouldn't give anything for them. Ultimately, they were kind of sold out by their country so that they could save face and keep fighting beyond the point. Theoretically, if the German government cared about its army, it should have surrendered after the failure of the 100-day offensive. Failure after the spring offensive, but they didn't. And I guess kind of the most kind of brutal moment in it is when Paul finally dies. The title, All Quiet on the Western Front, is the report that the General Staff files that day. And the idea is the insignificance of one wasted life, or even, I don't know, the tens of thousands of people who died that day is not considered significant enough to report. Paul, I think, is fairly happy when he finally dies, because at this point in time he has no idea what he's going to do when he comes back. What was left of his identity had been based in the love he had for his comrades, and they're all dead now. And there's nothing remaining for war. He probably would have turned to crime or stayed in the army or become suicidal. And how they came to power. You had a generation of young men like Paul who had given everything for a war that the German government had lost, largely due to its own incompetence and poor strategic planning. And they had been promised all this stuff. They had basically fought, and in the end they had lost. And they had lost a humiliating defeat. And more than that, even though Germany was basically strategically defeated, you had the stab in the back where communist revolutionaries led to kind of a collapse of German society. The fleet mutinied, there were communist governments proclaimed to collapse Germany, and that's kind of ultimately what finally ended the war. And the combination of these men basically sacrificing their souls to serve the fatherland and the revolution at home meant that people wanted revenge on the Bolsheviks at all costs. They wanted revenge on the Allies at all costs. And they were willing to do anything to have a rematch, even if ultimately the chances of beating all of their enemies single-handedly were very low. They just wanted another roll of the dice. And I think that really kind of sets the stage for it. So that's my reaction review of All Quiet on the Western Front. I hope you enjoyed it. I highly recommend the book. This is Argent, and I'll talk to you guys later.